So, good morning, everyone. We talked on Saturday about self-compassion versus self-pity, and it occurred to me to revisit compassion today because as I was thinking about that talk, I was uh, reminded how challenging it can be, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about this morning. That we've all had the experience of wanting to be compassionate, and then finding ourselves not able to get there or not able to do it well. And a friend is going through something painful, we want to be present, but then we sort of contract a little bit, or we feel this pull to fix it or to avoid it, or we get flooded with our own emotions. We get triggered because it reminds us of something we're dealing with. And so we sit beside suffering and suddenly discover that what we're feeling is not quite compassion. It might even be something, it can be something closer to dread. That this is not, but this is not a personal failing. This is one of the important things that I think the Dharma can help us understand. The historical Buddha, as you know, I say this all the time, was, I think, the greatest psychologist that ever lived. And not in a mystical sense, but in a very practical one. He observed the human mind with incredible precision and gave us a really clear map, in my view, of how suffering arises and how it ends. And when we look at that and we look at what he and later teachers said about compassion, once again, we find something that modern psychology is only now catching up to, and that is that compassion and what we call in psychology empathic distress are not the same thing. And confusing them, conflating them is one of the reasons we struggle to stay open during those moments when someone else is suffering. When someone's suffering touches our unresolved fears, our grief, our sense of helplessness, what arises is not necessarily compassion. What can arise is distress. And this distinction is really important because if we don't recognize it, because distress contracts us, it makes us want to pull away, it makes us want to avoid, it makes us want to minimize the pain in front of us, and narrows our window of tolerance until we either shut down or feel overwhelmed. Now, contemporary research in emotional neuroscience uses precisely this language of empathic distress. And they talk about things like window of tolerance, affect or feeling regulation, empathic distress. But what strikes me again and again is how closely this more modern research mirrors what the Dharma has been pointing to for 25, 26 centuries. Contrast it with true compassion, which by definition is spacious. It can hold suffering, our own or others, without being consumed by it. And that the notion of being consumed by it is critical to this, because compassion, when we're fully with it, doesn't make us prisoners of what we're witnessing and ask us to see clearly, to see deeply, to care deeply, and to remain open, but with a certain boundary in place. It is a certain stability in the presence of others' pain, or our own pain for that matter. And it allows, if you see people that work with the dying all the time, you watch them sit with presence but with equanimity, or a parent holding a frightened child without transmitting their own fear back to the child, which could just ramp it up. The care is real, the care is full, the overwhelm is not. Now, a useful frame, and one I find myself returning to often, is to think of compassion not as an emotion exactly, but as a quality of attunement, a quality of attunement. Again, whether to others or to ourselves. And practice helps us cultivate this. I've seen this in my own life in the 7 years that I've facilitated this bereavement group for parents who've lost a child. I've just gotten better at being able to hold their suffering without getting triggered or pulled into my own suffering. And where we're going with this is a willingness to be present with what's showing up, with what is here right now, the particular suffering that appears in the moment. Because too often we're bringing in our own history, our own what ifs, and so forth. And understood this way, compassion carries no agenda. It doesn't require that we fix whatever the suffering is. It it doesn't require the person to be other than who they are. It doesn't judge. It simply wants to be with what is, and in that presence to offer care. And it's a bigger challenge than we often give credit for. Um, Stephen Batchelor, when he reworked the Four Noble Truths, his first one is to experience life fully, including suffering. Not to explain it away, not to escape it, but to meet it with open eyes and an open heart. When he asks us to embrace the full range of human experience, including the darkness, he's saying just show up. And then the second step is to let reactivity be. In other words, once we're present with the suffering, not to be driven by it. Okay? Just try to rein in the reactivity, and that could be in the form of our own upset, our own memories, our own fears of the future. When compassion arises from presence rather than reactivity, it is a lived example of wisdom on our path. But when it arises from our own unresolved discomfort, it becomes about us. And the person we're intending to help or offer comfort to ends up managing our feelings instead of receiving our care, reassuring us, telling us it's not so bad, just trying to take care of us. It just flips the script. I believe that compassion is a natural capacity of the human heart. But the more useful question is not how do I create it, how do I manufacture it, but what is preventing it from arising fully in the moment. And this is how the Buddha framed it, and this is actually also how modern psychology frames it. We don't need to install any new hardware, we just need to get out of the way to reduce the interference, to not bring all of our own stuff to that moment. Because when the mind is flooded with anxiety or caught in loops of self-concern, there just isn't room for the sensitivity and the real empathy that compassion requires. The additional resources are spent when we are focused on our own suffering in those moments. And it's a natural thing in terms of other suffering triggering our own. We need to make this part of the practice. And this is one reason why our meditation practice makes such a measurable difference. Because when we sit, as the nervous system settles, the self-referential noise quiets, the heart tends to open on its own. When we cultivate deep states of calm through our meditation, repeatedly, we discover that compassion and warmth arise naturally once the mind begins to steady. They don't have to be summoned. They don't have to be, as I said, manufactured. They simply emerge. So that said, then another obstacle, and a somewhat more subtle one, is taking suffering too personally, either that of ourselves or others. If we haven't found a way to hold and be with our own pain with some degree of equanimity, we're likely to flood when we encounter pain in others. It just triggers this flood of our own difficulty with our own suffering, because our own unprocessed grief, fear, helplessness, whatever, becomes the lens through which we see everything. What we feel isn't compassion. What we feel is our own wounds reactivated. And again, I think this is a really critical distinction. Mindfulness practice is one of the most reliable antidotes to this, because when we learn to be present and not try to escape our own difficult experience without suppressing it, without being swept up and away by it, we build the capacity to do the same with others. It widens what we call the window of tolerance. We learn slowly to let suffering matter without letting it obliterate us. Most of us just want to turn around and run away from it, our own or others. But the Buddha says, no, that is just kicks the can down the road. Learn to be with it. Compassion is not a moral demand. It's not a duty to be self-sacrificing. It's a natural response, again, as I said, of genuine care when we get out of the way. And it nourishes us as much as it benefits others. I mean, that's sort of the secret here. Here's something I want to say clearly because it's often misunderstood. Cultivating compassion does not mean placing ourselves under an obligation to feel it at all times. We simply can't do that. Or to sacrifice our own well-being in the service of trying to always bring it to others. All this framing does is produce guilt and burnout, a forced kind of compassion that exhausts us rather than nourishes us. It is compassion as performance, and it's not helpful to anyone, including ourselves. So as I said, in the Dharma, compassion is not a moral demand. It's a natural response that comes from genuine care, from generosity, from empathy, and the simple recognition that we all share the suffering, that others suffer as we do. It breaks down barriers. It fosters connection. And when seen that way, it feels more like relief than a burden. It opens us rather than depletes us. And that's a criteria we can use. The practice of compassion at its best enriches the one who is compassionate as much as it benefits those who receive. Now, safety matters here. So if someone's, in distress, but, we feel threatened physically, emotionally, or however, compassion is very hard under those circumstances. We shouldn't hold ourselves to those standards. But one of the things that meditation does is help us sort of tease out and soften this overactive threat detection system of our nervous system. You'll recall, as I've spoken about this in the past, that psychology now understands that there's a threat detection system in us. It's a collection of brain structures constantly scan the environment for danger, emotional, physical, survival danger, operates automatically, operates rapidly as it needs to. It's part of the evolutionary heritage that helped us survive as a species. The key components include things like the amygdala, which signals danger in the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which helps us regulate our response to perceived threats. So it helps us feel safe when it's accurately giving us a read on the current situation, safe enough to remain open to being compassionate. And as we develop greater skill in working with difficulty, we become less likely to see suffering as a threat, to turn away from it, unless there is a genuine threat. Okay. It helps build confidence, not arrogance, but trust in our capacity to meet whatever arises, which is itself a condition for compassion, being willing to meet whatever arises. Buddhism has always understood that compassion and liberation from suffering are mutually reinforcing. As we become freer from reactivity, freer from self-clinging, as we actualize this path of ethical conduct, of mindfulness, of wisdom, our capacity for compassion naturally opens and deepens. So again, as I keep saying, we've got to get out of the way. But as our compassion deepens, our motivation to be free of the suffering that we bring on ourselves when we're faced with someone else's suffering becomes clearer. We begin to see more clearly how suffering arises. We begin to see the clinging and the other things behind it and how we can reduce it. Not just our own, the suffering that we see around us. And again, this is not some grand gesture, heroic sacrifice, something flashy. It's small moments, pausing to be present with what is difficult for ourselves, with what is difficult for someone else. Looking at suffering, and this is critical, with kindness, not with judgment. Noticing the pain of someone nearby and allowing it to matter, but not taking it on. These moments, practiced again and again, gradually open the heart in ways that sometimes surprise us, actually. You know, the Buddha often evoked this image when talking about this of a mother's love for her child. It's boundless, it's natural, it requires no argument, no convincing. We just have to get out of the way. And what I find so powerful about that image that he invokes of the mother and the child is not its intensity, but its effortlessness. It's just a natural thing. This is a love and a caring that doesn't need to be manufactured. It arises because it is part of who we are when we don't get in the way. As our practice deepens, these obstructions thin out. The mind grows quieter, more spacious. This is what we begin to see. This is how we recover this capacity. Again, compassion is not something we build from scratch. It is something that's there, which we find a way to return to. I can't say that often enough. It's not an achievement. It's not a seeking thing. It is a homecoming. It is coming back to ourselves unobstructed by all the noise that we always introduce into the system, which is why our sitting practice is so critical, because it helps quiet all of that noise. So those are some thoughts this morning on the challenge of finding that compassion within us, reducing that empathic distress, and keeping getting out of the way. So let us talk about it. Let me stop this with this.